They called it the toy run, and they laughed when they said it. I was sitting at the respondent's rail when the presiding officer read the designation into the record, not as an insult, exactly, but as a statement of fact. The Terran Free Collective's operating license, reference indent 79 Tau, covered what the Vethani Commerce Syndicate had formally classified, across 11 years of quarterly reviews, as a Class 4 civilian recreational route. Toy Run was the shorthand. It was in the margin notes of their own internal docket. Apparently no one had thought to remove it before the session opened. The chamber was smaller than the ones I had seen on Vethani propaganda displays. Those showed sweeping amphitheaters and tiered balconies lit in amber. This was a working room, a long rectangular table of brushed composite, 8 delegate chairs down each side, and a raised bench at the head where the presiding officer sat flanked by 2 clerks. The air smelled of recycled filtrate and faintly of something resinous, like old ceremony. I had been told the syndicate chambers always smelled that way. I believed it. I was the only human in the room. Behind me, the gallery held 4 syndicate observers with the long, flat facial planes and the triple lens eyes of the Vethani midcast. None of them were looking at me. They were talking to each other in low bursts of subsonic click speech, the kind that passed for corridor gossip in most of the inner systems. The tone was light. This was, as I said, a small item on the docket. Presiding Officer Sarath Vel, I am using the transliterated name, his full designation in Vethani Click Register was 14 syllables, read the revocation grounds without looking up. Insufficient commercial throughput. Failure to meet the reclassification threshold under the syndicate's amended trade code, Section 12, Paragraph 4. The Terran Collective's freight volumes, he noted, had not exceeded the Class 4 ceiling in any of the last 6 review cycles. The syndicate had given notice 3 times. We had not contested the notice. Therefore, the license would be formally revoked, the route designation cleared, and the slot reallocated to a commercial carrier of appropriate throughput capacity. He set down the document. He looked at me for the first time. To his left, a delegate whose translated designation I had memorized as Commodore Adjunct Velis Orn was already consulting something on a hand slate. He was the syndicate's commercial flow director, the officer responsible, at least nominally, for the throughput assessments that had produced the 6 consecutive Class 4 reviews. He had the distracted, settled look of a man completing an administrative task he had completed 100 times before. Does the respondent wish to contest the revocation? I let a moment pass. Then I reached into the document case on the table in front of me, took out a single-bound ledger, standard Terran archival format, cream cover, black binding tape, the collective stamp on the front, and slid it across the table toward the presiding officer's clerks. I said, "No contest. The ledger is for the record." Sarath Vel glanced at it without opening it. One of the clerks pulled it closer and began to page through. The presiding officer was already reaching for the next item on the docket when the clerk set a hand flat on the table, not a gesture I had ever seen a Vethani make in a formal setting. It was the equivalent, I later learned, of a sharp intake of breath. Sarath Vel stopped. The clerk turned the ledger so the presiding officer could read it from where he sat. He read. He read for a long time. Then he picked it up and read it more carefully, with both sets of auxiliary eyes open, which the Vethani do when they need to process something precisely rather than quickly. The ledger was not complicated. It was a transit manifest, 11 years of it, broken down by station stop, by cargo type, by frequency. Every run. Every berth. The toy run, as they had called it, made 43 stops per circuit along the inner corridor. 14 of those stops were syndicate-operated stations, resupply depots, relay platforms, 1 full habitat ring at the corridor's midpoint. The manifest listed what we had carried into each of those 14 stations on every pass. Medical consumables. Pressure seal patches. Filtration cores. Calibration standards for the navigation arrays. Replacement actuators for the life support cycling rigs. The specific compounds used in the syndicate's own environmental maintenance systems, available in that formulation from exactly one supplier in the inner arm, a small Terran chemical house that did not hold a syndicate commercial license because its output volume was, by syndicate standards, a rounding error. None of those 14 stations had a secondary supply arrangement on record. The ledger noted that too, in a separate column. I had added it myself 8 months earlier, when I began to understand what the revocation notice would mean. Sarath Vel set the ledger down. He looked at me. These stations have no alternative source for the filtration cores. Not on an approved syndicate manifest, no, I said. The calibration standards? Same. He was quiet for several seconds. Around the table, delegates had begun pulling their own records. The portable data slates they carried lit up one after another as people began cross-checking. The gallery observers had stopped talking. One of them had moved to the rail to look over a delegate's shoulder at a slate. "The revocation is already registered," one of the delegates said. He was looking at his slate, not at anyone in particular. His tone was flat and factual in the way that the Vethani are flat and factual when they are not yet ready to call something a problem. "The slot has been submitted for reallocation. The queue process requires a minimum of 30 administrative cycles to reverse. 30 administrative cycles on the syndicate's calendar worked out to approximately 9 standard weeks." Velis Orn was still looking at his slate. Something in his posture had changed, a slight forward lean, the triple-lensed eyes cycling through their registers quickly, the way a Vethani processes data they find genuinely unexpected rather than merely inconvenient. He had done the throughput assessments. He had signed 3 of the 6 quarterly reviews himself. Whatever formula he had applied, it had not asked what the cargo was. Only how much. The syndicate's classification system was built around volume thresholds, not content. A filtration core and a ceremonial textile took up the same cubic measure. The ledger made the distinction the classification system had never thought to make. I knew that. I had known it for 8 months. I had filed 3 requests asking the syndicate to clarify the secondary supply status of the 14 stations before the revocation was actioned. The requests had been routed to the Commercial Classification Office. 2 had been acknowledged. None had been answered. I did not say any of that. It was in the ledger. Sarath Vel opened it again, to the appendix at the back. I had attached the filed requests there. Reference numbers, submission dates, routing confirmations. He read through them without speaking. Then he closed the ledger and held it in both hands for a moment, looking at the table. "When did Vethani Station 7 last receive a calibration standard delivery?" he asked the room. No one answered immediately. A clerk began querying something. Another delegate was already on a private channel, the small light behind his left ear blinking rapidly. The answer came from the gallery. One of the observers had pulled the number. 42 days ago, he said. Standard delivery interval is 38 days. The toy run, he paused. He seemed to hear the phrase differently now that he had said it himself. The collective's run was due in 6 days. It was not due in 6 days anymore. I sat with my hands on the table and waited. There was nothing more to say, and I was not going to be the one to say it. The session did not close in the usual way. Sarath Vel asked the clerks to hold the docket pending emergency consultation with the Station Operations Authority. He did not look at me again before he left. The delegates filed out in 1s and 2s, most of them still looking at their slates or talking in low, rapid click bursts that the dispersing room no longer carried well. Station 7 declared emergency rationing 6 days later. Station 11 followed 4 days after that. A third platform, a relay node at the corridor's far end, began reporting filtration degradation in its tertiary ring within the same window. The syndicate's emergency reallocation took 11 weeks. The carrier they found could not source the Terran Chemical House's filtration compound at all, wrong certifications, wrong volume, wrong distribution chain. They ended up running a temporary contract back through the collective while the permanent paperwork cleared. They did not use the phrase toy run in any of the subsequent filings. I was back at my desk in the collective's depot office when the first contract extension came through. Standard commercial form, Class 2 throughput classification, a category higher than we had ever held. No notation in the margin. No shorthand. Just a route number and a schedule and a signature from the commercial classification office. I countersigned it and filed it and went back to work. Velis Orn had retired by then. I do not know if that was related. In the Vethani Syndicate, the relationship between administrative outcome and individual career is not something they publish. What I know is that the Commercial Classification Office issued a revised assessment framework for the inner corridor routes the following year. The new framework included a cargo criticality index alongside the volume threshold. A notation in the preamble acknowledged that prior classification methodology had not adequately accounted for supply chain dependencies at station level. They did not name the toy run. They did not need to. The corridor was not going to supply itself.